Hi, this is Rob from Rob's Rose Coffees, bringing you the fourth part of our coffee processing series, Part 2D, the wet hulled process. We're going to talk today a little bit about why it's called wet hulled. What does that mean to the flavors in your cup if you buy a bag of coffee beans that say wet hulled on the label? And where is it popular? What does it mean to the whole processing? Just as a quick reminder, there are 4 parts to this coffee process series. 2A was the natural process, 2B was the washed process, 2C was the honey process, and now you're watching 2D, the wet hulled process. If you have any questions, comments, or requests, please leave them in the notes below and I'll try to get to all of them. So what is the wet hulled process? Why is it special? It was invented in Indonesia because the climate in Indonesia required some unique processing. It's a remarkably humid climate. Indonesia is a string of islands. Java, Sumatra, Bali, some of the names you might recognize. The weather patterns are a little more unpredictable than other coffee growing regions in the world. So what you see there in the first 3 photos looks a lot like the washed process. If you watched our video 2B on the washed process, you're going to depulp the cherries mechanically, leaving a little bit of mucilage on the coffee bean. Then you're going to soak the beans in water and let them ferment for 12 to 48 hours. And then you're going to wash the mucilage off of them. And all of that looks and sounds pretty much exactly the same as a washed process coffee bean. But this is where it departs and gets different. Because when it comes to drying the coffee beans, we can't dry them as long as you can in other parts of the world in Indonesia. So we're only going to dry them until they're 50% dry, which is still a lot of moisture and certainly not ready for shipping. And it makes the next step a tricky process. When you send the beans that are only 50% dry to be dehulled, that's why it's called a wet hulled process. The hulls are going to be a little tougher, a little harder to strip off of the coffee bean. And the final hulling process is the wet hulled process. And it's a little more radical, a little more vigorous hulling process. They use different types of machinery to strip that last layer of parchment off of the coffee bean in order to get it dry enough to be able to and clean enough to be able to ship off to the coffee roasters. What this means to the flavor in your cup is that you're probably going to get bolder flavors. The moisture that stayed on the coffee bean and is imparting more of the flavors from the mucilage, the pulp, and the hull into the coffee bean. And that final wet hulled stage is going to give you kind of a more robust flavor. Sumatra, Bali, Java are probably more famous as dark roast coffee origins, and certainly one of my favorites as a lover of dark roast coffee. But the final result of this process is going to be just like all the others. We need to get those clean green coffee beans that have moisture levels are reduced to 11%. It's just going to happen a little bit quicker and in a little bit different way than the other coffee processes that we've talked about so far. So that's the fourth in our series of coffee processing, the wet hulled process. Hopefully you've enjoyed listening to these clips, these explanations. If you have questions, comments, or requests, please leave them below and I'll be glad to respond as best I can. Thank you for listening.